Welcome, Michelle. It is fantastic to have you here today. I really want to thank you for your time coming in to talk to our Connected Yoga Teacher group because I know that this time is really busy for you and also I'm guessing a challenging time. So I wanted to do a check-in first just to see how are you doing today?
Thank you for inviting me to be on the show, and I'm doing okay this morning. Sometimes it can take my body a while to, or my spirit a while to catch up with what is going on, and it's been really busy. So yesterday I wasn't feeling that great, and I'm feeling all right today.
Thank you so much for being here. Your time is really, it's great to have you here to answer some questions that yoga teachers have been having, to talk to us about what we as yoga teachers and yoga studios can do moving forward. So I want to do a little introduction for those who are here. If you're here live, let us know in the chat, say a hello, tell us where you're watching from. And if you're here for the replay as well, let us know. And for those of you who don't know Michelle already, Michelle Johnson is a social justice activist, an author, an empath, a yoga teacher and practitioner, an intuitive healer. And also as a licensed clinical social worker, Michelle has a really deep understanding of how trauma impacts the body, the mind, the spirit, the heart. And her awareness of the world through her own experience as a Black woman allows her to know firsthand how privilege and power operate. So Michelle has over 20 years of experience leading and dismantling racism. She has led dismantling racism trainings with large corporations, so small nonprofits, community groups, so the ACLU, Duke University, Google, This American Life, Lululemon, and lots more. I found Michelle because of your book. I got really interested in your Skill in Action book. It was Shara and Maria of the Live Like You Love Yourself podcast. I talked to them last week and they told me that you're a person to connect with for sure. They were really excited about your work. So you wrote that book in 2017, is that correct?
Yeah, I self-published, so it came out in 2018, but I finished writing it in 2017.
Amazing. And you're based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Is that also right?
Yeah.
And so is there anything else that I'm missing in your bio or things that we should know about you?
Well, I think, one thing given the time we're in right now is that, as you read in my bio, that I've been doing this work of dismantling racism and systems of oppression for a really long time. And then within yoga spaces, I've been teaching yoga for 11 years. So within yoga spaces for longer than the book has come out for, right? Longer than the last 2 years. I was doing this work prior to that. And what's happening in this particular moment is it feels like, because of the amount of requests I've gotten over the last 2 weeks and interest in the book and booking me to come lead a workshop, that something's happened in the spiritual community in the last week. Of course, a lot has happened in the world. And so I just want, folks to remember that we're coming to this space with different emotions, feelings, lived experiences that define how we show up in this particular moment. And that some folks have been very awake to what has been going on for a long, long time. And we're also in this moment where there's clearly an awakening happening, a reawakening. I'm not sure which, maybe both. And so I just want to name that. And for folks to honor the people that have been most marginalized by systems, have been leading work to dismantle systems of oppression. Like, this isn't new. And so to honor those folks as people are learning, right? And trying to understand what's going on in this moment.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that this morning. Is it frustrating to be like, I've been doing this work for 20 years and now my email's full and my, everyone's wanting me to speak or do workshops. Okay. Like, what does that feel like? And how could we approach people like me as a podcaster? I'm like, oh my gosh, I heard about you through other people, which is generally the way I like to pick guests for the podcast. But I also, I was kind of reluctant to reach out because I knew your inbox must be full.
Well, the reality is it was full prior to the moment too, right?
Right.
So I don't feel frustrated at this particular moment in time, although over the last couple of weeks I've had moments of that, because I don't want people to have to die for people to wake up. Right. And I think that is what happened, and many people died, right? And we're also in a pandemic, and so the moment it's different in some ways, and then some things are not different at all. Some things are new for us, and we're having this global experience of a pandemic, and police brutality continues, and Black bodies continue to not be valued, right? And so that's not new. And so I've had moments of I think curiosity more than frustration around why it takes people dying for people to raise consciousness about what is actually happening. Mm-hmm. I think that's what I'm curious about and sitting with, and like, what about us as humans, what in our psyche like makes us not awaken to things that are happening around us and that people we're in relationship to, and just to see what is really going on. And I have some thoughts about that, but I've just been sitting with that because my fear is that people will go back to sleep, will forget, right? When because we can't stay in this place of crisis or sort of this level of intensity forever. It can't sustain itself. The nervous system's like that too individually. It can't sustain intense sensation and crisis forever and ever. So that's what I mean when I say we as a collective, we're not going to stay in this exact moment and the intensity of it in the same way for the long haul. And so I think there's a risk then for people to go back to sleep and back into their lives and to forget. And then that means more people have to die for people to remember. And that's the cycle I want us to break.
Right. So tell me well, first of all, it almost feels like to me, I don't need to explain why we as yoga teachers and yoga studios, why this is an issue for us. But in case there's someone out there saying, you know what, like I don't see how this relates to me as a yoga teacher or as a yoga studio, what do you sort of say to that, first of all?
Well, in my own practice and understanding of yoga, part of the practice is about revealing the causes of suffering and the nature of suffering so that we can then break patterns and find some liberation. And that is what we are doing in this particular moment as a collective. We are trying to dismantle systems and break patterns and uplift truths, right, and reveal patterns so that we can create conditions for liberation. So I can do that individually as a yoga practitioner. As the collective, the world's turning, right, is doing that right now in a really profound, poignant way. And so that is the link for me. And certainly there are many people who have access to yoga spaces where they're not talking about at this moment, maybe every spaces, I don't know, but prior to this particular moment, there were many yoga spaces that were not centering what was happening in the collective and the culture. And sometimes inviting people to escape from that. And I don't think that's possible given that yoga is about connection and acknowledges there's no separation. Right. And so if there's no separation, then that means I need to see what's going on for me, and I need to see what's going on interpersonally with others and in relationship to the planet and the collective. And that means that I need to see the ways in which I'm suffering and perpetuating suffering so that I can then understand how to create spaces for liberation for myself and others. Because yoga also suggests that we are connected in that way, right? We have shared humanity. Right. And that's why I think it's important and relevant. And I feel like if people study the philosophy of yoga, it says that very clearly, Like it's over and over, actually.
Right.
The Sutras, the Gita says it over and over and over. The eight-limb path over and over and over, right? Like how we are supposed to study and show up and live into this practice.
So what are some of the ways we as yoga teachers can keep this going? Because I am hearing this week and seeing this week, like this is a marathon and you've been doing this work for so long. I see this wave of people jumping in to do this work. And what do you think are some of the ways that we can keep this going and run businesses that are really steeped in I want to say steeped in anti-racism, but then also I know that I'm learning the wording. Like I'm not even sure if that's what you would call out as the wording.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think in this moment, we are in some ways the collective's highlighting racism and how it's happened, and that makes a lot of sense given what's going on, right? And I don't just mean police brutality; I also mean COVID, because of the people that are dying from COVID, which happen to be, I mean, a lot of people are dying and suffering from it, and the people that are dying disproportionately are Black people, right? Mm-hmm. And so we are in this moment where we're centering racism as a collective and calling for Black bodies to be valued. That's going on, but you know, racism is also connected to every other form of oppression and other systems like capitalism. Like sexism, like heterosexism, like transphobia, right? Any system of supremacy, they're all interlinked. And I lead with race because I'm Black and that's visible to people. And as I always say, it means something very clearly, like it means something to this culture, what it means to be Black. And the culture is defining what it means to be Black and therefore what it means to be me, different than my own definition of what it means to be me and to be Black. And so, that's the most salient identity I embody, but I have an awareness that I'm an intersectional being. I'm a woman, I'm middle class, I'm able-bodied, I'm heterosexual, right? And so I lead with race as a way to deepen our lens and understand how systems of oppression work, with an awareness that really what I'm talking about is how power works. And that is similar with every other form of oppression, right? So the patriarchy and sexism works in a similar way to racism. Heterosexism, ableism, ageism. So how power's been constructed is to, you know, make people who are able-bodied and who are white and who are male and who are heterosexual and who are middle class have more power. They have closer proximity to power. And folks who are trans and experiencing homelessness and living with a disability, right, to have less power. I'm not naming every identity, but I just want to explain that even if I center race, I have an understanding that there are many other people suffering because of how oppression operates. And I would say, right. Yeah, to yoga teachers or business owners, that part of what I think would be helpful is to understand how capitalism affects whether or not we are able to live into our humanity and what yoga is and what yoga means. I would just offer that, like, sit with that question of how does capitalism play out as you are actually trying to live into yoga and the values of yoga? Because often capitalism will make us at odds with our values and our humanity and what we actually know to be true.
Do you think that generally yoga teachers think, oh, well, that already my studio is that way. You know, I see people as equal. I care for the planet. Like some people will name it as spiritual bypassing. I don't know how to define it, but I feel like yoga teachers feel like sometimes there's this and I'm like putting all yoga teachers into a big bucket here of we're doing the work of, you know, we're all one, but you're saying it is there. And I think that and that's maybe that part of like seeing something that we couldn't see before. So can you give us an example of how maybe that's showing up, that capitalism?
Well, you know, I was interviewed yesterday and I said, I don't own a studio, but I am a yoga teacher and in some ways making a living from that, but also making a living from leading race equity work too with organizations, right? And so I don't know what it's like to try to keep doors open of a studio, I do know what it's like to try to sustain myself as I do this really challenging work and freelance, right? So I do know that experience, and that it's not easy. And I also know that if I am concerned, which makes sense, rightly so, about paying my mortgage, for example, that I need to be really mindful, because I want to be in integrity, and fear will make me move out of integrity. Right? Which makes sense, because I want a home, right? So paying a mortgage is like, I want shelter, right?
Right.
So I'm not judging that. I'm just sort of explaining the psychology behind it. And I think for yoga studios, it's not easy to keep, yoga studios are closing all over the place right now. It is not easy because of COVID and not being able to be in community in person and teaching online, but also it's been challenging for some studios to set up online platforms, because there's a learning curve there for many people. So I understand that it's a challenging landscape to keep a studio open to try to make a living as a yoga teacher. And I also think sometimes that makes or has made yoga teachers prioritize just bringing in bodies without thinking about the bodies they are leaving out of the space, right? So I'm going to do this trendy thing, and I'm going to invite all of these people in, and I'm going to leave out a lot of people who don't have access. And I'm going to invite people in which may or may not be aligned with the philosophy of yoga and the practice of yoga, like the true essence of yoga. But I need to keep my doors open. So I'm going to do what I need to do to make that happen. And again, I'm sort of just explaining how I understand this. I'm not judging, or I hope I'm not. I'm just explaining what I think goes on and what I've witnessed. I've worked in many yoga studios, right? Yes. So I need 40 people in my class so that the lights can stay on in the studio. And so, I've seen that and witnessed that. And I also think that, speaks to wellness and the industry of that, and who's prioritized in that and who's not. So it's not as if we're just talking about yoga teachers or movement teachers here. And so I would just invite teachers to think about how they can be in integrity. What does it mean to be in integrity as we live into this practice of yoga?
You've brought up something here, the people that we're leaving out. And I know that yoga teachers are in no way trying to do that. They want everyone to come to yoga. A small example of this is I was talking to a yoga studio this week who said, we got called out for having all white people on our website, that we're not being inclusive. And then they wanted to revamp some of the images on their social media and on their website or add to it. And then there was this pause of I don't know how to do this, because it feels like it's then tokenism. Am I just pulling a picture of a Black woman onto our site can you speak to that a little bit, of how we can go about this work of kind of bringing people in, making them feel like, yes, I am welcome in this space in different ways?
Well, what I'll name is that in this moment, a lot of yoga studios are asking, how can we be more inclusive in response to what is going on culturally and how that's showing up in yoga spaces, right, or online spaces at this moment in time because of social distancing. And so, and some yoga teachers have had that question for a very long time. And it's not a quick fix. That's what I want to say. And so the moment that a teacher or a studio owner is saying, I got called out for this thing, we're an all white space or perceived in that way, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to make this be an inclusive space. Creating an inclusive space is different than making it look like it's a space that's inclusive.
Right.
So it's right for that teacher or studio owner to pause, to say, something feels misaligned about me, either getting stock photos or having a photo shoot with people of color that may or may not be in my studio, and paying them to do that photo shoot and then put them on the website.
Right.
If there's uneasiness in that moment, don't do it. That is not the fix.
Right.
And we as yoga practitioners know in our bodies, often know when something is misaligned, right? When something is off and there's a question, right? And I don't know if I should be doing this. I would say then probably not, right? Probably not adding people, because that is tokenization and it's not true culture shift. And it's not inclusivity, because inclusivity is really about engaging multiple perspectives, lived experiences, people with different identities, and allowing them, in particular marginalized identities, and allowing them to shape the culture of the space. So there's a website that lives on a computer, right? That certainly affects culture, but different than a space where people feel welcome. You know, all different people feel like this is a space for me. I see myself represented here. I understand why the studio is focusing on inclusion and liberatory work, or creating liberatory spaces. The studio has made a commitment to make this be an ongoing conversation, an ongoing process. That is much deeper and actually much more difficult than adding people to a website, a diverse group of people to a website. And so, and what is happening right now is there's frenzy. There's a lot of frenzy. And in particular, I've noticed this with white teachers and people over the last 2 weeks, because that is a lot of who is contacting me to say, I need help doing this thing, which I mean, this is my work. This is what I do in the world. Although I don't just work with white people or white yoga teachers. And my work is about liberation and creating culture shift and inclusive spaces. And I feel like that urgency is, I mean, we are living through horrific times. So it makes sense that people feel urgency. And I also feel like there's a risk for people to make a lot of mistakes, because we don't know what we don't know. And if a white yoga teacher has always had the experience of feeling welcomed in a yoga space, then they have no idea what it's like on a cellular level to be in a body that has not been welcomed into yoga or movement spaces. And so the idea that, like, I don't have any idea what this feels like, but I'm gonna fix it, a lot of mistake making will happen in that moment. And so I just wanna offer, like, this is where our practice comes into play. If we're truly practicing, then we're gonna be mindful as we decide how we want to respond and create inclusive wellness spaces. If we're being reactive, we're gonna be in the urgency, which it is urgent, to be very clear, and it has been urgent, and we're gonna be wrapped up in the frenzy, and we may actually harm people more who've been marginalized from the spaces we create or trying to create. So I just wanna caution people. And it's hard to balance out mindfulness and urgency. And I just think this is where practice comes in. Like, I feel like the practice calls me into really witnessing and noticing, even if it's for a moment, right? To notice that uneasiness about what I'm about to do, to pause me and say, do I really need to do this? You know, what I said at the beginning about the website. So the web, what you were saying about adding people to the website, like, do I really, is this an alignment?
Right. Someone is asking in our comments here, should I let the fear of making mistakes stop me? It has. So I've heard from so many yoga teachers this week of, I want to say something, but I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. I want people to know that I stand right now with Black Lives Matter, but I also, as a white person, have no idea what to say, or haven't been having this conversation, or I'm new to it, or whatever. And so they're afraid to make those mistakes. Do you have any thoughts around that?
So one thing that I understand about whiteness, and this is true of other systems of supremacy too, what I understand about whiteness, one thing is that the conditioning that happens and what we're internalizing is that we need to be perfect. And I'm saying we because whiteness is affecting Black, Indigenous people of color and white people. So that's why I'm saying we, like, I'm taking in that message too. I'm also taking in the message that I'm imperfect, that I'm abnormal, right? I'm taking in these negative messages, but the culture is saying it must be perfect. And I just want to say it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to be messy, and you will make mistakes. And I'm just suggesting, like, let's be mindful as we take action. And then if we make a mistake and we're aware of it, or someone brings it to our attention, can we practice being in a space of deep listening to what they're saying, especially if they're marginalized and we are not? And then can we acknowledge that we caused harm? And can we commit to do better next time? And can we know that we might make the same mistake again? Mm-hmm. It's like, that is I mean, this also feels like spiritual practice to me too. It's like, It's ongoing. There is discomfort. We will learn as we go, right? We will shift who we are as we learn. And so that's why it feels like practice to me in that way. And I've heard a lot of people say, I don't want to make a mistake. And I've heard this a lot from white teachers as well. And I just always say, and not to be provocative, while white people are contemplating how to make their action perfect, people are suffering and dying.
Right.
And I've also said, be mindful as you respond, which is different than being reactive and caught up in the frenzy. So I'm like inviting people to hold a lot of things. And I recognize that at this moment in time. And also that is the practice, right? To hold these multiple things, multiple truths. So I just think like, yes, be cautious, be mindful, be thoughtful, be responsive. And what will set in for people is sort of emotional paralysis if they are stuck in it needing to be perfect and then they don't do anything, which privilege actually allows people who have closer proximity to power to not do anything anyway. Mm-hmm. Except we're like suffering, our humanity's suffering if we don't do anything. So that is what I would offer. Like, it's real to be afraid of making mistakes. And part of that's cultural conditioning from dominant culture. And part of that is it's just believing it needs to be, there's one right way, and there's not.
Right. You're not going to give us a checklist of like, do this and do this and do this. And oftentimes that's what we want. We want the quick fix. I understand these thoughts, and our chat is full of other teachers feeling the same thing. Like, we want to take action. We don't want to just sit by. And I'm up for making the mistakes. I've been making some fumbly mistakes, and I just keep saying, call me out on it, please. I'm here to learn. So one other person had written an email to me saying they're struggling as a yoga teacher to hold space. Mm-hmm. So to hold space, because we're not even in the same room together, most of us yet, also feeling just so weary right now. I think the news of COVID and being in a lockdown and dealing with the pandemic, and then on top of that, the news of the suffering of humanity right now. And this person is saying, you know what? I'm not interested in Michelle addressing my white guilt, but it's definitely happening. So this is a conversation. There were some people who were very vocal about this, maybe on their Instagram stories or in their Facebook groups, crying and being really emotional as white people, feeling the guilt, and then being called out for doing that. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that as we work through the different emotions that we have.
Well, when I would lead, and I still do, dismantling racism trainings, there was a colleague I worked with for many, many years. We often worked in biracial training teams. And so this colleague I'm referencing is a white woman. And she would talk about guilt and shame, and when white people get stuck in that space and don't move from that space, that then suffering persists. It's like, because to actually dismantle this system of racism in particular, white people are going to have to dismantle that. I'm dismantling something different in response to racism being in place. But because like Black, Indigenous people of color didn't create racism, and we didn't create white supremacy, although we're living with it, and certain things manifest because of what we're taking in, that white people will have to decide to dismantle this. So if a white person is stuck, which is different than noticing guilt or shame, but stuck in that place and unable to respond and overwhelmed, and then unable to really connect with what is going on in our culture, in our world, in our communities, that actually can cause more harm. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about the nervous system being overwhelmed constantly, just to be really clear with people. I am saying that Black, Indigenous, and people of color need white people to do their work, and that guilt can get in the way of doing work. And it can be a place to hide. And it is a natural, I think, part of the process of like consciousness and learning, guilt and shame. And I also I feel like there's so many resources right now. There are white caucuses, there are articles, there are white yoga teachers who are talking about this. So I would say that although I work with white people all the time in this work, as I named, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color together and separately, I would say that, you know, if you're a white person feeling guilt and shame, try to process that with another white person. As the person you offered the comment from said, I don't want Michelle to like have to hold this, right? And I don't feel like I am. I'm just responding to it. I would say to find those spaces with other white people where you can be vulnerable and share what is going on for you and talk about how you move through guilt and shame, so that then Black, Indigenous, and people of color are not having to hold that and respond to racism in real time, right? And white supremacy in real time. So I would offer that. And I would also say that I was a therapist for a long time, and I worked a lot with people who experienced trauma and felt shame. And forever and ever, I would be like, you know, shame is not a useful emotion and experience from my orientation as a therapist. Mm-hmm. And when I think about whiteness, though, as a system, I actually do wonder, and I'm using that language on purpose, if it is important for white people to feel shame related to our history and ancestral history, right? And how we came to be in this particular moment. I'm not saying stay in shame. I've just been really curious about, like, is that what has to happen? Is that what's happening now? Are white people like, oh, right, like I witnessed, you know, another Black man be murdered by the police, or I read the article about a Black woman being shot in her home, right, for no reason, right? Like, so I'm just wondering, is this a response that's like shame and then like alarm, I need to do something? And I don't know that. I'm really just in a place of curiosity about this. So while I don't think that internalized shame is useful, I do wonder if shame is a natural response when we think about history. Right. And who's been assigned power and who's not.
That's a really good curiosity to have right now. I know that I definitely felt, you know, that guilt or shame. And then I think you're right. I think, well, I can only speak from my own feelings, that it did feel like it fueled action, maybe fumbly action, maybe like, I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah. And a lot of contemplation. I like that you're looking at, maybe there's some use for shame as an emotion, or that guilt. Someone asked, are we still taking questions? Yes, for sure. Put your questions in the chat. I have some other questions that I'm just going through that were emailed to me, and I'll definitely look at these. Someone is saying, how does yoga specifically address guilt and shame?
Well, you know, I am a trauma-informed practitioner in general, in every space, not just yoga spaces. And what I understand about trauma-informed yoga and how it originated is in response to trauma that we've experienced in our physical bodies, or emotionally, right? Or mentally or spiritually. And then we wanted teachers to be really mindful of what has happened to the body and the spirit, and to teach in a way that can hold that trauma and respond. And along with trauma, guilt and shame can show up, in particular shame. And that, you know, trauma-informed yoga has been, in my mind, really individualized. And I'll say something more about that in just a moment, but it's been about the individual experience of trauma that someone has had, and then how we respond to the nervous system, right? Which includes, how do we respond to shame that is embodied, right? And has been internalized, and how do we teach people to move through that? And how do we move slowly enough if that's what people need? Or how do we activate, right? If that's what people need, because people need different things in response to trauma. So I would say yoga as a practice is a healing practice. Not only for us individually, but also collectively. And part of what we are trying to heal as a collective, which is very evident in this moment, is, you know, the guilt and shame related to history, as I named, is the trauma that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have experienced are experiencing on top of the ancestral trauma they embody. And so I feel like yoga as a movement practice, as we study yoga, as we meditate, as we change the way we breathe and practice pranayama, I feel like all of those things are to both allow us to witness, to change our thoughts, to calm the nervous system again if that's what it needs, to activate it if that's what it needs, right? To connect with the heart and to move through emotions, including this response of shame, right? Which can be an emotional experience. What I wanted to say about trauma-informed yoga is that, and we see this, we are in a moment, have been, of cultural trauma, but the pandemic has made that very clear, I think, for people, because we're having this shared experience, although we're experiencing it in very different ways. We're in a moment where, as I've named, all over the world, people are like protesting and calling people to value Black bodies, again, in a way I have never, ever seen. I'm almost 45. I've never seen this in my body, in my lifetime, in this lifetime. And so there's a moment, an acknowledgement that trauma has been happening, right? And now we can, like, something's activated and we can see it. And so I want trauma-informed yoga to actually respond to cultural trauma in addition to individual trauma, the traumas we embody. And so that is why I said it's very individualized in that way. Like, what does Michelle need based on the individual trauma she's experiencing related to racial trauma, right? I'm experiencing racial trauma, and so is every other Black, Indigenous, and person of color in different ways. And so what does it actually mean to have a trauma-informed practice that speaks to the cultural trauma we're experiencing? So that's why I just wanted to explain why I said it's like very individualized. And actually, I think there's an opportunity for us in this particular moment to talk about cultural trauma.
Right. Is there anything that you can see that our yoga teacher community could be offering in terms of that cultural trauma to aid in?
Yeah, a question that I invite people to contemplate in my movement classes and meditations is to think about how the external world is affecting them internally. And I'm asking everyone in the room to think about, and it sounds very simple, but it's not, because I'm saying, what is going on outside of the room? And if I said that in an online class today, people are thinking about COVID, they're thinking about police brutality, they're thinking about spaces burning, they're thinking about defunding the police, they're thinking about all these, right? It's like, I don't have to say much more than, right, how is the external affecting your internal body? And then we are having an experience in this moment where all of us are being affected in different ways. Like, I would just invite teachers to start to say that and to sit with that question, because it's not simple. It sounds simple, but it's not, because so many yoga spaces have not invited people to bring in the external, which is always alive in the room anyway. Like, it's always there. I'm inviting people to bring attention to that. How are you holding this in your body, right? How are we holding this as a collective? And these are just questions I'll like call out into the space. And I know people are sitting with them and both wondering where they're coming from, but also like, oh, I haven't necessarily thought about this before in my seated meditation, right? Or tabletop position, or whatever position, right? I haven't thought about it in this way. So that is how I feel like teachers, one way they can address it. I also think I'm writing a second book about collective grief and cultural trauma. And so because I think about these things all of the time, and I feel like we can be, as teachers, make spaces for people to grieve, because people are having an individual grief response and we are having a collective grief response. And that is part of why protest is happening, because anger is connected with grief, right? Like years and years, decades, centuries, people saying, we are not being cared for. Deep grief is connected to that, right? And deep heartbreak. And so I feel like as space holders, we can invite people to grieve.
Yeah. Oh, this is really powerful, that we're not trying to shut out what's going on in the world as yoga teachers in our spaces and in our communication, in our online classes. And each teacher, I think, will have to figure out how to do that on their own, like in their own unique way, for sure. But I would feel really weird about going to a class right now if it was like everything is perfect in the world. If that was the message I got, I would feel like, am I in a different am I in a different time? One of our teachers wrote in and said, I'm wanting to add a social justice component to a YTTM co-planning. I'm in a small community with very few people of color or Black people, and one of them, none of them focus on social justice. So this is the question of like, is it acceptable, or should I, lead this and study books such as yours, or should I pull someone in as the teacher to facilitate this conversation? And this is something I'm hearing from yoga teachers all over. I did an interview that's not out yet, and I said, what do you think we need to be looking at for our YTTs? And this person said, we need more voices, more people of color in our teacher trainings. And I live in a really white community. I'm trying to think if ever there's been a person of color at one of the 200-hour yoga teacher trainings around here. I don't think so. So what do you think about, do we have that conversation, or do we pull someone in?
I think that you can do both. I think you can invite someone in, and when I went through teacher training, it was 2009, and I didn't really hear social justice being centered at all. And over the last few years, I've heard more and more people within the yoga community, within wellness spaces, talking about social justice and how to center it. And so I'm saying that because I feel like there are more people now who can be brought in, who have a social justice lens, who can share that in their teaching. And I absolutely think it is, and we talked about this a little earlier, the responsibility of the teacher, right, the main teacher holding the space, to also be talking about social justice from their perspective, even if it's like, I don't know how to do this, and this is what I'm thinking about, right? Like, I'm thinking about this, I'm contemplating how to center justice, this is what justice means to me, this is what I've noticed about injustice, this is where I'm like, what I'm studying and thinking about, these are the questions I have, even if it's that, right? And then continuing to do that as the training goes on, and just inviting in different voices, because that again is a way of engaging multiple perspectives, which will shift the culture of the training experience. And we know this because many trainings are set up with teachers, many I've been part of, are set up with teachers from very different lineages, so that students are exposed to people from different lineages. Same thing is engaging multiple perspectives centered on social justice and how we infuse that into our practice of yoga and how we live yoga. So I think we do both.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. This is such a good question. I'm so glad that someone asked this. Can you discuss this term? I don't know if you would call it BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color, or is it Black and Indigenous? I love that someone's asking this.
So I say Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and then I'll say BIPOC because that can sometimes feel like a lot to say over and over. And I will say that this question's been coming up a lot because this is new terminology for many. And in fact, it's new for me because I didn't really see it 2 years ago. I think that may have been when I began to see this written down. And before that, what I was saying was people of color. And in my training spaces, when I was trained up as a dismantling racism trainer, we were saying people of color. And when I was a child, no one was saying people of color. People were saying white, people were saying Black, people may have been saying Asian, right? Hispanic, people were saying that. But so I'm just saying this because the language shifts. And language, when it shifts, is an indication that culture's shifting. And it's one of the indicators, right? Because language is so tied to culture. And so Black, Indigenous, and people of color is an acknowledgement, and there's so much more that I will not say about this, but it's an acknowledgement of how race was constructed. Earlier I said white people created white supremacy and racism, and we'll have to dismantle it. Part of that creation was to create a hierarchy around race and was to construct what race meant. And the reason that we know this is because not all white people became white at the same time. And there's some resources on a website called dismantlingracism.org There's a whole history of the race construct. There are a ton of articles, there are a ton of resources, and it outlines like how race was constructed, this history, and who was positioned to have power then. So the hierarchy has white at the top. This is not, I always have to say, this is not what I believe. This is how race was constructed.
Right.
White is at the top of the hierarchy based on how it was created, Black at the bottom. Indigenous people were not represented on the hierarchy because of forced assimilation and attempted annihilation of Indigenous people. And this is why in certain parts of the country, the narrative about Indigenous people is they are extinct. That is what I learned in Virginia when I was a child. I knew that was not true. I mean, especially there, knew that was not true, right? But that is what my history teacher was telling me. So, you know, Indigenous folks can be made invisible in so many ways that feel very different than my experience of racism. And I work very closely with a colleague who's Occaneechi Indigenous, and she talks about this, like the narrative that her culture's dead, right? And that she's extinct. So we say Black because Black's at the bottom of the hierarchy. Indigenous next, because Indigenous is not represented on the hierarchy. So it's been made invisible by whiteness. And other people of color, so we say in people of color, are moving between those two fixed points of white and Black. So we are acknowledging that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are having a shared experience of systemic racism, while also trying to name the ways in which being Black, because of that hierarchy, and being Indigenous are different, that we were just positioned in a different way. And again, this is how race was constructed. And I love that we're using this term BIPOC because I think it speaks more truthfully about the hierarchy than saying people of color, because we're not having the same experience, even though we're having a shared experience of systemic racism. Not exactly the same. So that was a long answer, but I just want it to be clear.
It's so good. I'm so glad that you also pointed out this website so that we can go and learn.
Yeah.
That's the other exciting part right now. I think one of the biggest things that I have been doing is listening to a lot of different voices, you know, and not getting my information all from one place. Like you said, my Canadian white school had very different information that it shared with me as I was growing up. You know, my white parents did the best they could based in the society that we're in, so we can really dig in and learn. It's exciting that we can do that. This is a longer question. It's going to cut both of our heads off. But this person is saying, I'm biracial. I've never fit in anywhere. Have often felt fear connecting with Black communities. Despite my light complexion, I've experienced vulgar acts of racism since I was small, but I worry that when I reach out to BIPOC communities that I will be seen as not having a place. Any thoughts on this?
So I grew up with a biracial brother, and certainly we had he's much lighter skinned than I am, and so we had very different experiences, adopted and biracial, different experiences growing up. And I have sat in many what we call caucus spaces that are for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, where there have been people who are biracial in those spaces. And I've witnessed some of the tension you're naming, right? About, I don't know if I fit there. I want to reach out to BIPOC people, but I'm not sure. And, you know, I don't have the lived experience of being biracial, so I don't know what that is like in my body. What I want to offer is that for people who are biracial, think about how you live your life. And what I mean is how you're positioned by culture. And so my brother would never be seen as white. Like, he's not white passing, for example. He could, but people aren't sure that he's Black and white. Like, they often can't tell. So he gets the very inappropriate question, what are you? Which happens to a lot of mixed race and biracial people, which is completely horrific and a terrible question to ask someone. So I just want to say that. I've been in spaces where there are people who are white passing, are biracial, and it just creates some interesting dynamics that we need to then work through. And I led a caucus last week, and this was coming up in the caucus, because the caucus was for any BIPOC person, including people who were biracial and wanted to be in that caucus. And we're in a moment where Black lives are being highlighted. And so there was a Like, everyone's having an experience of systemic racism. We're having it a different way. And in this particular moment, this is what's happening to Black people based on the racial hierarchy. I had to do a lot of that in that space so that people felt like, you have a place here. You're having an experience of racism. And yet, here are the ways in which my experience is different than my brother, for example, or someone who's lighter skin or white passing. The other thing I'll say is I've been in spaces where trainings where that we've had a white caucus and someone who is white passing, so I'm sure that's an obvious term to people, has gone to the white caucus because they are seen as white, and that is what they wanted to, the space they wanted to be in, to understand how they've been internalizing whiteness. So to you, I would just offer, like, think about, one, this isn't an easy place to be. I just want to acknowledge that. And two, that sometimes biracial folks I work with in community with, think about, how am I internalizing white supremacy or superiority, and how am I internalizing racial inferiority? And to look at both instead of feeling fragmented and having to choose one or the other. And I would say to people that are lighter skinned or white passing or higher up in the hierarchy, to think about privileges that they are given because of that, while people who are dark skinned like me, or even darker than me, are definitely never seen as white, right? And privileges are taken away or never assigned to us based on race. So again, that was a long answer, but I appreciate the person asking the question.
I've been also following some people that are biracial online, and I like hearing this conversation. Like, I like hearing the stories of people, of what their experience in life is. It helps me understand a little bit more of what someone's life has been like, or the struggles of this. And also people of color right now. I know someone said in the comments, like, and here's the thing with all of this conversation, I've heard a lot of discomfort. I've felt a lot of discomfort. And there have been many yoga teachers who I learn from who have said, we're in this place of discomfort. This is not a bad thing to be in a place of discomfort. This is where we learn. Is anything that you would suggest that, okay, if we want to sign up for this marathon and this learning, like, if you were to wave a magic wand and all of the yoga teachers would have sort of this, I know we can't make a checklist for everyone, but like, let's just check in. Are we doing this? Are we doing that? Are there some things, like 3 to 5 things where we'd start?
I would say practice being with your discomfort, which the practice of yoga will help you with. There are a ton of resources that have not always been in place. I just want to say, like, 20 years ago, there were books on white fragility or skill and action. You know, it's like we have a lot more resources and articles available easily if you can access a computer or a bookstore or the library. So I just want to say there are a lot of resources, and some of them are mentioned on the website. So learn, like, commit to learning. And then there may be discomfort, and then learning some more, and discomfort, learning some more. I would say to notice whose voices are being centered in this particular moment, and how much, if you're somebody who's white or has closer proximity to power, how much your voice is being centered, or how much you're centering your voice, and can you bring in other voices, right, who actually have the lived experience of what it means to experience white supremacy, right? We're all living in a white supremacist culture, but what does it mean to experience it? How can we center those perspectives and uplift those voices? And I would say if you're white, to talk to other white people. If you're a yoga teacher that's a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, there are caucus spaces where we can be together for our own healing in this moment. And we need to learn too, right? Because there are many people who are left out of yoga spaces, not just based on race. So there's a lot of work for all of us to do. So I would say that, be with the discomfort, be in healing spaces where you can, reach out for those resources because there are many, and continue to talk about this and center what is happening, but notice whose voices are being centered as you do that.
This is so good. I really appreciate your time. I know that we are for an hour of conversation, this is really just scratching the surface of things. I know our yoga teachers had a ton of questions. I would encourage our connected yoga teachers to keep putting questions here in this thread or in the group. Let's really continue this conversation. Let's dig into how else we can help. One other thing that some yoga teachers have been asking me, where should I donate? Do you have any thoughts on that for people who want to donate?
There's a list. I would have to look for it, and maybe I can send it to you to share on the. There's a list that's going around about where to donate, and there's also a list about anti-racism resources the list has been put together in response to this particular moment. So both of those things, it's a Google document, and that may include the places to donate, but I also saw another article and document about where to donate. Okay. I can share that with you to then follow up with people.
Sure. That'd be amazing. And if our connected yoga teachers want to study a little bit more with you, I know your trainings were filling up quickly, but would they go to your website? Is that how they would find you?
Yes, you can go to my website. My trainings are filling up, and I'm going to be adding some more trainings. And I'm also going to start a book club for Skill and Action in, I think, June 21st. That's not on my website yet, but it will be this week because I'm going to announce it this week. And I've never done this before. I've done book readings, but I've never held a book club myself. I have a book club guide that's free on my website, all of that, but I'm going to actually be conducting this book club.
Ooh.
So if people are interested, I will, that will be on my website this week. And there are plenty of other ways to connect. Most of it's online right now. I don't know when I'll be able to travel again, but there are a lot of ways to connect.
That's amazing. I'm really excited I get to study with you a little bit more, and I'll try and bring any resources back to our connected yoga teachers that I can. I also wanted to make a note also that our sponsor, OfferingTree, this was, a scheduled OfferingTree Q&A, and they are they're a Minnesota-based public benefit company. And so then they are joining with us, the Connected Yoga Teacher team and others, to really take concrete steps to fight systemic racism. And this is the other way we can find companies that really stand behind this as well. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time today, Michelle. Your words are really comforting. I would encourage everyone to go out and go to the library and get your book or read your book, and we can have more of a discussion here in the group. We can keep the conversation going. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.